March 12, 1943. Somewhere over the Solomon Islands, 7,000 feet above the coral reefs and jungle canopy, Lieutenant Commander Paul Sullivan's Grumman F-6F Hellcat began screaming in protest. The cylinder head temperature gauge needle was buried deep into the red zone, trembling like a panic heartbeat. His oil pressure was climbing past recommended limits. The engine roar had changed pitch, a metallic snarl that every manual, every training instructor, every engineering officer had warned him meant imminent catastrophic failure. Enemy Zeros were closing from the east, glinting silver in the midday glare. His wingman was already trailing smoke. The textbook said pull back throttle, reduce manifold pressure, descend immediately, preserve the engine. Sullivan looked at the fuel mixture lever, the throttle quadrant, the propeller pitch control. Then he did the exact opposite. He pushed everything forward. Full rich mixture, maximum manifold pressure, high RPM. The engine didn't explode. It sang. The Hellcat surged forward with violence that slammed him back into his seat, and he tore into the enemy formation with a speed no one thought that engine could sustain. The Zeros scattered. Sullivan's wingman made it home. The engine, which should have been a molten wreck, purred smoothly all the way back to the carrier. And when the maintenance chief opened the cowling on the flight deck, he found something impossible. The cylinders were cooler than engines run by the book. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Paul Sullivan grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, in a house that smelled like engine oil and sawdust. His father ran a small aircraft repair shop on the edge of a municipal airfield, the kind of place where barnstormers and crop dusters brought their battered biplanes for resurrection. Young Paul spent his childhood elbow deep in radial engines, learning not from textbooks, but from the grease-stained empiricism of men who flew machines held together by wire and luck. He learned to read an engine not by its specifications, but by its sound, its smell, its vibration through the airframe. He learned that engineers wrote manuals in quiet offices, but pilots and mechanics learned truth in the air and on the ramp. By the time he was 16, Paul could tear down and rebuild a Wright Whirlwind radial engine in a single afternoon. He understood that engines were not mathematics. They were living things, breathing things, their behavior shaped by air density, humidity, fuel quality, and 1,000 variables no manual could predict. He learned something else too, something that would later save his life and redefine fighter tactics across the Pacific. He learned that the red line on a gauge was not a law of physics. It was a lawyer's compromise, a safety margin built on worst-case assumptions, institutional caution, and the fear of litigation. It was a suggestion, not a limit. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, Paul was 22 years old and already had a commercial pilot's license and 2 years of junior college engineering coursework. He enlisted in the Navy within 48 hours. He wanted to fly fighters, to put his hands on the most powerful, most sophisticated engines America could build. The Navy sent him to flight training in Pensacola, Florida, where he learned aerobatics, navigation, gunnery, and the ironclad doctrine of engine management. His instructors were strict, methodical, and terrified of engine failure. They drilled into every cadet the sacred parameters. Never exceed manifold pressure limits. Never run full rich mixture except for takeoff and combat emergency. Never push cylinder head temperatures into the red. Never, ever ignore the gauges. Engines were expensive. Pilots were replaceable. The rules were written in the blood of men who had pushed too hard and fallen from the sky in flames. Paul listened, nodded, took notes. He passed every test. He graduated third in his class, but he did not believe them. By early 1943, Paul Sullivan was flying F-6F Hellcats from the deck of USS Essex, part of a fighter squadron tasked with air superiority over the Solomon Islands. The Hellcat was a beast, a blunt-nosed, thick-winged brute powered by a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower. It was faster than the Zero in a dive, tougher in a fight, and more forgiving in a carrier landing. But it had a reputation. Pilots called it a hot runner. The R 2800 engine ran hotter than earlier models, and the Hellcat's compact cowling and tropical operating environment made cooling a constant concern. Cylinder head temperatures would spike during climbs, during prolonged combat, during anything more aggressive than a leisurely cruise. Pilots were instructed to manage temperatures religiously, lean out the mixture at altitude, reduce power during climbs, open cowl flaps, monitor gauges constantly. If temps climbed into the red zone, pull back immediately or risk warping cylinders, cracking heads, seizing pistons, or burning through exhaust valves. The consequences were drilled into them. Catastrophic engine failure, bailout over enemy territory, death by drowning, by fire, by capture. Paul followed the procedures at first, but he watched. He listened. He noticed something the manuals did not mention. When he pushed the engine hard, when he ran in the red for short bursts during combat, the temps would spike, yes, but they would stabilize. They would not spiral into destruction. The engine would not seize. In fact, the engine seemed to run smoother, stronger, more responsive when pushed beyond the book limits. He began experimenting. On solo patrols, when no one was watching, he would climb steeply with full power and full, rich mixture, watching the cylinder head temp gauge crawl into forbidden territory. He would hold it there, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes. The gauge stayed high. The engine kept running. When he leveled off and reduced power, the temperatures dropped quickly, faster than expected. The oil pressure remained stable. There was no knocking, no roughness, no smoke. He started taking notes, logging conditions, altitudes, fuel states, humidity, mixture settings, power settings, temperature readings. He was conducting his own flight test program, one the Navy had no idea existed. Paul's squadron began flying daily combat air patrols and bomber escort missions into the heart of Japanese-held territory. The enemy was dug in, well-supplied, and fielded experienced pilots flying the legendary Mitsubishi, a 6M0, a fighter famous for its agility, climb rate, and long range. The Zero had weaknesses: light armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, limited firepower, but was flown by men who knew their machine intimately and exploited every advantage. American doctrine counted the Zero's agility with speed and altitude. Hellcat pilots were taught to stay fast, stay high, dive through enemy formations, make one high-speed firing pass, and zoom back up to altitude. Never dogfight, never slow down, never turn with a Zero. It was sound advice, but it assumed your engine would cooperate. It assumed you could maintain high power settings without cooking your engine. It assumed you had the altitude and speed to dictate the terms of engagement. In reality, combat was chaos. You got bounced at low altitude. You got separated from your flight. You found yourself alone, low on fuel, with Zeros on your tail and no room to dive. And the manual said, be gentle with that throttle. Paul watched good pilots die because they followed the manual. He watched wingmen pull back power to cool their engines and lose speed at the worst possible moment. He watched bombers get slaughtered because their escorts couldn't maintain high power climbs long enough to intercept incoming fighters. He watched men bail out over the ocean because their engines failed, not from being pushed too hard, but from being babied into inefficiency, running too cool, too lean, too cautiously, building up carbon deposits and hot spots and detonation that eventually killed them anyway. The manual was not keeping people alive. It was killing them with caution. On the morning of March 12, 1943, Sullivan's squadron was tasked with escorting a strike package of TBF Avenger torpedo bombers targeting Japanese shipping near Kalambangra Island. Intelligence reported light opposition. The strike package launched at dawn, 12 Avengers, 8 Hellcats as escort. The sky was clear, the ocean a glittering mirror, the air heavy with tropical humidity. They flew low, hugging the wave tops to stay under Japanese radar, then climbed to 8,000 feet as they approached the target area. The Avengers began their attack runs. That's when the Zeros appeared. Not 3 or 4, as intelligence predicted. 16 of them, diving out of the sun in a perfectly coordinated bounce. The ambush was textbook. The Zeros came in high and fast, slashing through the Hellcat formation before anyone could react. Sullivan's wingman, Ensign Bobby Hernandez, took cannon fire through his engine cowling in the first pass. Smoke poured from the cowl. Hernandez's voice crackled over the radio, tight with panic. Lead! I'm hit! I'm losing oil pressure. Temps going crazy. Sullivan broke hard left. try and stay with Hernandez, but 3 Zeros were already circling back for a second pass. The rest of the Japanese fighters were going after the Avengers, who were slow, low, and defenseless. The entire strike package was about to be annihilated. Sullivan made a decision in less than a second. He could follow doctrine, maintain moderate power, conserve his engine, and try to shepherd the formation home while the Zeros picked them apart one by one. Or he could do what every manual, every instructor, every safety officer said was suicide. He shoved the throttle to the firewall. Full manifold pressure. 65 inches of mercury. The R 2800 engine bellowed. He pushed the mixture control to full rich, dumping raw fuel into the cylinders, a setting reserved only for takeoff or emergency situations lasting no more than a few seconds. He pulled the propeller to maximum RPM. The Hellcat leaped forward like it had been kicked. The acceleration was shocking. The airspeed indicator needle spun upward. The cylinder head temperature gauge climbed fast, stabbing into the red zone, past the red zone, into a realm where the gauge had no markings because no one was supposed to go there. Sullivan ignored it. He held full power. The engine kept roaring. The oil pressure spiked high, but stayed solid. No roughness. No detonation. No smoke. The Hellcat rocketed toward the Zeros with a speed they weren't expecting. Sullivan opened fire at 400 yards. Too far for a kill, but close enough to disrupt their attack run. Tracers laced the air. The Zeros scattered. One broke left. One broke right. The third tried to loop over the top. Sullivan stayed full throttle. Pulled into a climbing turn that should have cooked his engine into slag, and followed the Zero through the top of the loop. The Hellcat stayed with him. The Zero pilot, accustomed to outturning every American fighter he'd ever faced, suddenly found himself looking at a Hellcat closing from 6 o'clock at an impossible angle. Sullivan fired a 2-second burst. The Zero came apart. Pieces of wing and cowling fluttered away. The fighter rolled inverted and spiraled into the ocean. Sullivan's temp gauge was still buried in the red. The engine was still roaring. He reversed hard, looking for Hernandez. His wingman was 2,000 feet below, limping toward home, trailing a thin streamer of black smoke. 2 Zeros were converging on him from opposite sides. Hernandez had maybe 10 seconds to live. Sullivan rolled inverted and dove. Full throttle. Full rich. Maximum RPM. The Hellcat plummeted like a meteor. The airspeed indicator went past 400 knots. The engine screamed, inhaling air and fuel in quantities the engineers said would destroy it. The dive was so steep, so fast, that Sullivan's vision tunneled. The G-forces pinned him into the seat. He pulled out barely 500 feet above the water, directly between Hernandez and the nearest Zero. He fired without aiming. Pure instinct, a long, sustained burst that threw tracers across the Zero's flight path. The Japanese pilot flinched, broke off, turned away. The second Zero, seeing Sullivan's speed and angle, decided discretion was the better part of valor and climbed back toward altitude. Sullivan stayed with Hernandez, flying formation on his damaged wingman, scanning the sky for more threats. His engine was still screaming. His temp gauge was still in the red. They were 50 miles from the carrier. Hernandez's engine was coughing, misfiring, losing power. If more Zeros showed up, they were finished. Sullivan stayed full throttle for another 3 minutes, maintaining high speed, staying unpredictable. His fuel was dropping fast. His engine temp was beyond anything he'd ever seen. He could smell hot oil, hot metal. But the engine never faltered. Finally, the rest of the squadron reformed around them. The Zeros disengaged. The strike package, bloody but intact, turned for home. When Sullivan landed on the carrier, his engine was still running smoothly. He taxied into the landing area, shut down, and climbed out. The plane captain, a grizzled mechanic named Chief Kowalski, was already climbing up onto the wing with a flashlight and a checklist. Kowalski opened the cowling. He stared. He pulled off his cap. He called over 2 more mechanics. They stared too. Sullivan walked over, still pulling off his gloves. "What?" Kowalski pointed inside the cowling. "Sir, your cylinders, they're barely warm." Sullivan blinked. "What?" Kowalski touched the cylinder heads with bare hand. I've been working on these engines for 2 years. After a combat mission, especially a hard one, these heads are so hot you can't touch them for 10 minutes. Yours are, I don't know, lukewarm. Warm, yeah, but nothing like they should be. How long were you at full power? Sullivan hesitated. Most of the mission. Kowalski stared at him. That's impossible. Sullivan said nothing. Kowalski pulled a rag from his pocket, wiped his hands, and shook his head. Manual says sustained high power in the red zone will crack heads, warp cylinders, burn valves. You should have seized halfway home. But your engine's in better shape than half the planes that flew easy patrols today. What the hell did you do? Sullivan didn't answer, not directly. He asked to see the maintenance logs of the squadron's entire Hellcat fleet. Kowalski was confused, but handed them over. Sullivan spread the logs across the ready room table and started reading. He cross-referenced engine temperatures, power settings, mission profiles, and engine failures. A pattern emerged. Engines run conservatively, with moderate power settings and careful temperature management. We're experiencing higher rates of valve problems, carbon buildup, and premature wear. Engines run harder, pushed occasionally into higher power regimes. We're lasting longer. The manual was wrong. Or more precisely, the manual was based on lab tests, static engine runs, and conservative assumptions that didn't account for real-world airflow, real-world cooling dynamics, real-world fuel combustion behavior. The engineers had assumed that high power meant high heat meant destruction, but they hadn't considered the cooling effect of high-speed airflow through the cowling during aggressive maneuvering. They hadn't considered that running full, rich mixture actually cooled the cylinders by using excess fuel as a coolant. They hadn't considered that high RPM meant better oil circulation and more efficient heat dissipation. They had optimized for engine longevity in peacetime conditions. Sullivan was optimizing for survival. He started briefing his pilots on what he called combat emergency power management. He didn't call it a new technique. He didn't present it as contradicting the manual. He framed it carefully as a way to interpret the manual's emergency procedures in the context of actual combat. He explained mixture theory, the cooling effect of fuel, the relationship between airflow and cylinder head temperature. He walked them through the logic. Yes, the gauge goes into the red. Yes, it looks terrifying. But if you're moving fast, if you're in clean air, if you're running full rich, the engine can handle it. Not forever. Not for cruise. But for the 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes of sustained combat maneuvering you need to stay alive and kill the enemy, the engine will not only survive, it will perform better than you've ever seen. Some pilots nodded. Some looked skeptical. A few looked horrified. But they were dying out there, and Sullivan was bringing people home. One by one, they started trying it. And one by one, they came back believers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Maria Torres was the first to test Sullivan's method under fire. On March 19th, 1 week after Sullivan's dogfight, Torres was leading a 4-plane division on a bomber escort mission when they were bounced by 9 Zeros at 12,000 feet. Torres's division was outnumbered, outpositioned, and out of altitude. Doctrine said disengage, dive away, use speed to escape. But the bombers they were escorting would be slaughtered. Torres remembered Sullivan's briefing. She pushed her throttle to maximum, mixture full rich, and pulled into a vertical climb directly into the zero formation. Her wingmen followed. The Hellcats went ballistic, climbing at angles and speeds the Zeros couldn't match. The Japanese pilots, expecting the Americans to run, were caught flat-footed. Torres's division blew through the zero formation, guns blazing, then reversed at the top and came back down with gravity and power on their side. 2 Zeros went down in the first pass. The rest scattered. The bombers completed their attack and returned safely. Torres landed with her temp gauge still in the red and her engine purring. She found Sullivan in the ready room and shook his hand without saying a word. By early April, every pilot in the squadron was using Sullivan's techniques. Combat loss rates dropped. Kill ratios climbed. Pilots reported being able to maintain energy in dogfights. Sustained climbs longer, dictate engagement terms. The Hellcat, already a formidable fighter, became a monster. And the engines, which everyone feared would start failing catastrophically, didn't. Maintenance logs showed the opposite. Engine life improved. Failures dropped. The power plants were happier being used hard than being babied. But Sullivan's methods were still unofficial, still unendorsed, still technically in violation of the flight manual. That changed when the Air Group commander, Commander James Thatcher, flew a mission using Sullivan's power settings and came back convinced. Thatcher was a by-the-book officer, a Naval Academy graduate, cautious and methodical, but he was also a pragmatist. He could read the data. He called Sullivan into his office. "Explain to me why my engines aren't melting." Sullivan laid out the theory, the cooling dynamics, the fuel mixture chemistry, the empirical logs. Thatcher listened in silence. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "You're telling me the entire naval aviation engineering establishment doesn't understand their own engines?" Sullivan chose his words carefully. "I'm saying the engineers optimize for the wrong problem. They optimize for longevity under average conditions. We need optimization for survival under maximum stress. The engine can do it. We just have to let it." Thatcher made a decision. He authorized Sullivan to conduct a formal test program with instrumented aircraft, control conditions, and detailed data collection. Sullivan flew dozens of test flights over the next 3 weeks, measuring cylinder head temps, oil pressure, fuel flow, airspeed, and cooling airflow across a range of power settings, mixture settings, altitudes, and airspeeds. The results were unambiguous. At high airspeeds, with high airflow through the cowling, the R, 2800 engine could sustain full power and full rich mixture for up to 15 minutes without exceeding safe internal temperatures. The cylinder head temp gauge, which measured external surface temperature, spiked into the red because the external skin heated faster than the internal components. But the internal temps, the ones that mattered, stayed within safe limits because the combustion chambers were being cooled by excess fuel, and because the high-speed airflow was stripping heat away from the cylinders faster than it could build up. The gauge was lying. Or rather, the gauge was telling a truth that didn't matter. The red line wasn't physics. It was policy. Thatcher forwarded Sullivan's data to the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics with a formal recommendation to revise the flight manual and engine operating limits for the F-6F Hellcat. The response came back 6 weeks later. Denied. The reasoning was bureaucratic and technical. The data was insufficient. The test methodology was non-standard. The proposed changes would undermine standardized training. And there was the unspoken reason. If the Navy officially endorsed Sullivan's techniques, it would mean admitting the manuals were wrong. It would mean admitting pilots had died because they followed the rules. That admission was politically and legally unacceptable. Thatcher was furious, but his hands were tied. He couldn't officially change the manual, but he could do something else. He wrote a classified tactical bulletin, distributed only within the Air Group, titled Emergency Power Management for High-Threat Combat Environments. It didn't contradict the manual. It simply clarified how to interpret emergency power settings during combat. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic judo, technically complying with regulations while completely undermining them. The bulletin spread. Pilots photocopied it. Maintenance officers read it. Other squadrons started adopting the techniques. By mid-1943, Sullivan's methods were being used informally across multiple carrier air groups in the Pacific Fleet. The official manual remained unchanged, but nobody followed it. In the ready rooms, in the cockpits, in the debrief sessions, a new doctrine was taking hold. Push the engine. Trust the machine. The red line is a suggestion, and the results spoke for themselves. By August 1943, U.S. Navy fighter squadrons in the Pacific were achieving kill ratios against Japanese fighters that were previously thought impossible. Hellcat pilots were routinely beating zeros in climbs, in sustained turns, in energy retention. Maintenance crews were reporting longer engine life and fewer failures. The R, 2800 engine, once considered temperamental and finicky, became known as one of the most reliable combat power plants in history. Sullivan flew 73 combat missions. He was credited with 11 confirmed kills and 4 probables. He survived the war without a scratch. But his greatest contribution wasn't his personal score. It was the hundreds of pilots who came home because they knew they could push their engines past the red line and live. After the war, Paul Sullivan left the Navy and went back to Nebraska. He never spoke publicly about his role in rewriting fighter tactics. There was no medal, no official recognition, no mention in the history books. The Navy's official histories credited improved Hellcat performance to pilot experience, tactical evolution, and engineering improvements, but never mentioned that a single junior officer had figured out the engines were being misused. In 1952, nearly a decade after Sullivan's combat tours, the Navy finally updated the F6F flight manual to include revised power settings that closely matched what Sullivan had discovered. The change was presented as a result of ongoing engineering analysis. No mention was made of combat experience or pilot innovation. Sullivan read the updated manual and smiled. In the 1960s, a researcher from the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum tracked Sullivan down for an oral history project. The researcher had been investigating the dramatic improvement in Hellcat performance in 1943 and had found references to Sullivan's tactical bulletin in archived squadron records. Sullivan gave a brief interview. He explained the theory, the testing, the results. The researcher asked why he'd risked his career and his life contradicting the manual. Sullivan thought for a long time. Then he said, "The manual was written by people who never had to fight Zeros at low altitude with a fuel gauge on empty and a wingman bleeding out. They were good people, smart people, but they didn't know what we knew. We knew the enemy wasn't the engine. The enemy was fear. Fear of the machine, fear of the red line, fear of stepping outside the box. I wasn't smarter than the engineers. I just had different information. I had the sound of that engine at full song. I had the feel of that airframe when it was giving me everything. I had the knowledge that if I didn't push, people would die. So I pushed, and the engine didn't break. It sang." Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. Paul Sullivan died in 1987 at the age of 66. His obituary in the Omaha World Herald mentioned his Navy service and his work as an aviation mechanic after the war. It did not mention that he had rewritten the rules of engine operation for an entire generation of fighter pilots. It did not mention that his willingness to question authority and trust empirical data over institutional doctrine had saved countless lives. Today, his story survives only in scattered maintenance logs, forgotten tactical bulletins, and the memories of old pilots who remember being told, in hushed voices in ready rooms across the Pacific, that the red line was negotiable. The principle Sullivan discovered, that engines could be safely operated beyond their published limits under the right conditions, became foundational to modern fighter tactics. Every fighter pilot today learns to manage engine performance dynamically, adjusting power settings based on real-time conditions rather than rigid rules. They learn to push when pushing is needed, to trust the machine, to read the gauges but not worship them. They don't know they're following lessons written in the sky over the Solomons by a mechanic son from Omaha who believed machines were meant to be understood, not feared. The irony is complete. The institution that refused to officially recognize Sullivan's innovations spent the next 80 years teaching them as gospel. Every flight manual, every engine management course, every tactical doctrine now incorporates the principles Sullivan discovered through intuition, experimentation, and sheer bloody-minded determination to bring his people home alive. His name appears nowhere in those manuals, but his fingerprints are on every page. The story of Paul Sullivan is a reminder that progress often comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up, not from laboratories and engineering departments, but from the sharp end of the spear where theory meets reality and failure means death. It's a reminder that the red lines we draw, the rules we enforce, the limits we respect, are often arbitrary, political, institutional compromises that have little to do with actual physical limits and everything to do with risk aversion, liability management, and bureaucratic inertia. It's a reminder that real innovation requires courage, not just intellectual courage, but physical courage, the willingness to stake your life on an idea, to fly into combat with your temp gauge in red, and your commanding officers shaking their heads, and your engine roaring like a god. Sullivan had that courage. He trusted the machine more than the manual, trusted his hands and his ears and his gut more than the cautious pronouncements of engineers who had never felt the slipstream or heard the guns. And because he trusted, because he tested, because he pushed, hundreds of men came home who otherwise would have burned or drowned in the vastness of the Pacific. They never knew his name, but they owed him their lives. That is a quiet ledger of unsung innovation. The names erased, the contributions forgotten, the bureaucracy taking credit for discoveries it tried to suppress. But the truth remains, carved into maintenance logs and combat reports, and the fading memories of men who flew when flying meant dying unless you were smarter, faster, and braver than the people writing the rules. Paul Sullivan was all three. He never sought recognition. He never wrote a book or gave a lecture or demanded his place in history. He fixed engines. He flew his missions. He brought his people home. And when the war ended, he went back to the airfield in Omaha and spent the rest of his life doing what he loved, which was make a machine sing. In the end, maybe that's enough. Maybe the truest heroes are the ones who never wanted parades, never needed medals, never cared if history remembered their names. They cared about the work. They cared about the mission. They cared about the men and women beside them. And when the world said it couldn't be done, when the manual said it was impossible, when the red line said stop, they smiled and pushed the throttle forward and proved that courage and competence can rewrite the laws of physics, or at least the parts of those laws that were never really laws at all, just fears dressed up in numbers and enforced by people who never had to fly.